Hello, my name's Jonathan Pugh, and in this 25 to 30 minute talk, I'm going to give you a brief taster of a book that David Chandler and myself have just finished called Anthropocene Islands, A Critical Agenda for Island Studies in the Anthropocene. What the talk will focus upon is less the details and nuances of that book and more how we think we are setting up the beginnings of a new conversation or the new stakes of what a critical agenda for island studies in the Anthropocene could look like. So I'm just going to dive straight in. There are only islands after the end of the world. Many Anthropocene scholars provide us with the key take-home message that they are writing after the end of the world. Not because they're necessarily writing about apocalypse, but because they are engaging the Anthropocene after the profound crisis of faith in Western modernity, which has swept across academia in recent decades. For many contemporary Anthropocene thinkers, artists, activists, policymakers, and many others besides, modern frameworks of reasoning, which claim to separate out humans from nature, to be able to grasp the world as a coherent, controllable, and manageable object, are part of the problem rather than the solution. In the Anthropocene, relational entanglements are understood to be too rich, vibrant, and complex to be commanded in this modern way. Indeed, it is widely noted that the problematic of relational entanglements is the problematic of contemporary Anthropocene thinking. Here Derrida resonates powerfully when he says that once faith in modern reasoning collapses, we are faced with the stark realization, quote, "There is no world, there are only islands." Now, Derrida's argument was focused upon Fording deconstruction as a method or approach for challenging the metaphysical claims of modern philosophy. For Derrida, islands were really key framing devices because they were the most obvious spaces of disruptive relations, which work against modernity's continual grasping for coherence and its metaphysical grounding propositions. But Anthropocene Islands, this book, significantly expands upon Derrida's observation, because we analyse how work with islands has become productive in the development of many of the core conceptual frameworks for contemporary Anthropocene thinking more generally. Islands have become emblematic, liminal, and transgressive spaces for work on the Anthropocene, both inside and outside the modernist world, both real and imagined, from which a great deal of Anthropocene thinking is drawn out, and developing powerful alternatives to hegemonic, modern, mainland, and one world thinking. If we were to summarise this widespread contemporary shift towards the work with islands which is taking place in Anthropocene thinking, in one set of concepts, it would be those of relational entanglements, relational awareness, and feedbacks. These are the key tropes of the book, of contemporary Anthropocene thinking, and of work with islands in the Anthropocene. As we explained throughout, in contemporary debates about the Anthropocene, islands are regularly invoked as having a different set of capacities, affordances, and potentialities to modern or mainland life. The widely heralded capacity of islands to respond to the environment as shaped by relational agency is the key way of understanding why islands have become so central for so much contemporary Anthropocene thinking. Islands exemplify how all life in the Anthropocene is relationally entangled and codependent. For those concerned with the hubris and counterproductive nature of modern frameworks of reasoning, the problem is the exclusion of relation and focus upon essences and linear or universal causality. The relations and feedback effects associated with the Anthropocene are widely held to be masked by and hidden from reductionist modern ontology and epistemology. Thus, working with islands plays a vital role in Anthropocene thinking, as precisely with islands that these relational effects come to the fore. Islands are a strong attraction and lure for today's contemporary Anthropocene scholarship, which seeks to challenge the hubris of modern frameworks of reasoning. In modernity, the separation, isolation, and relational dependencies of islands appear to be their weaknesses, holding back island development and productiveness. However, these relational sensitivities are today understood by many as key to planetary survival. To get one thing out of the way, to be clear, in this book we are not saying that there is such a thing as island thinking. There are, of course, only various ways of drawing upon and working with islands in different places and at different times in history. Under older European and modern thought, the island was often understood as insular, isolated, liminal, or backward, even populated by savages, when compared to continental mainland reasoning. Building directly from these older narratives, in more contemporary debates about climate change, islands are still, of course, frequently reductively framed in Western and modern fantasies of control, understood as helpless, disposable, or in need of saving by others. Here, islanders are often portrayed as passive victims, wanting to be saved from their sinking islands. Yet, we think the configurations and stakes of debate are also rapidly changing. Thus, for the first time, this book will update for the reader how the island is being rethought, worked with, and drawn upon in and for the development of more contemporary Anthropocene thinking. In particular, we are going to explain how islands have shifted from the margins to the centre of many international debates, precisely because, after the supposed closure of the modernist imaginary of progress, islands have emerged as emblematic sites for understanding relational entanglements, which have come to the forefront in the search for alternative forms of thought and practice in the Anthropocene. Thus, in this book, we go further than the more usual point made in the literature that islands are merely key figures or symbols for talking about transforming planetary conditions, for climate-induced migration, global warming, sea level rising, melting icebergs, coral reef degradation, plastic in the oceans, and so forth, the ongoing effects of empire and colonialism, nuclear radiation, and so on. In all these cases, the figure of the island has very obviously emerged as one of the emblematic symbols of the Anthropocene. But in Anthropocene islands, we don't only write about islands in the Anthropocene. Rather, we draw out heuristically and examine in detail thinking with islands after the end of the world. The approach we take is less one of advocating what island thinking and practices should be, and more about schematically drawing out and analysing the many ways in which these conceptualizations are today being developed in and for the Anthropocene. The book updates, takes stock, and heuristically examines how Anthropocene thinking widely draws upon and is being developed through working with islands as liminal spaces beyond or in excess of modern linear and universalistic framings. It examines how islands and island cultures have this particular power, lure, or purchase in debates when it comes to the development of Anthropocene thought and related practices. An heuristic framing for analysing how islands engender contemporary Anthropocene thinking. The purpose of this book is to conceptually clarify and draw out, for the first time in the literature, what we see as the key shift to working with islands in a broad range of contemporary Anthropocene thinking and associated practices. Working with islands, or relational thought per se, is not one homogeneous other to modernist or mainland approaches. And so it is important to start a conversation about how we engage in working through the rich variety of possibilities and opportunities that island-orientated approaches afford today. In order to initiate this process, in this book we start to carve out 4 tendencies, or analytics, which position the figure of the island centrally within broader debates about the Anthropocene, what we call resilience, patchworks, correlation, and storiation. These mark out 2 sets of conceptual sliding scales, which, in the first half of the book, focus upon ontology, which is in resilience and patchworks, and in the second half, epistemology, correlation, and storiation. By the use of conceptual sliding scales or continuum, we seek to illustrate how much Anthropocene thinking extends its purchase and increasingly loses its modernist constraints, both in terms of a shift from linear causality and universalism and away from the foundational grounding of the Kantian subject in terms of conceptions of linear time and flat space. Drawing upon a really large number of authors' works and examples, the power of islands and thinking with islands is really heavily evidenced in this book in a way that we clearly can't go to in a brief talk. We illustrate how island imaginaries of human-world relations are shaped in non-modernist ways in the Anthropocene. In the conclusion, we explain how our initial set of 4 analytical distinctions could serve as a starting point for sparking discussion about a critical agenda for island studies in the Anthropocene going forward. Thus, we see this book as the starting point for a broader project, what we're calling Anthropocene Islands, focusing upon conceptually and heuristically exploring what is taking place in working with islands in contemporary Anthropocene thinking, and how this could become the beginning for a wider discussion reflecting upon how island scholarship opens up the Anthropocene as a problematic more broadly. As just noted, the approaches to relational ontology examined in this book are those of resilience and what we call patchworks. After the introductory chapter, chapter 2 focused upon resilience. Resilience is the analytic which has positioned islands and islanders most dramatically on the international stage. Resilience moves against a telos of linear progress and is about the dynamic adaptive powers of interactive life. Much of early resilience research was developed on islands and still is today. Indeed, the first question which C.S. Holling, who was a founder of resilience theory, asked people who wanted to work on his programs was, can you work on islands? But why islands? Well, because islands exemplify the properties of life that resilience is most interested in. As Darwin and Wallace demonstrated, life itself, which they revealed to the wider world by working with island life, does not tend towards a telos of linear progress, but speciation and differentiation as adaptive and non-linear. Heuristically or analytically, resilience, as an expression of working with islands, draws out how the resilient capacities of island life and islanders are part and parcel of spatially and temporally fixed assemblages, with autonomous capacities for self-ordering or adaptation, whether these are island communities or islands as interactive socio-ecological systems. Resilience thus traces and responds to relational entanglements, affordances and feedback effects over time and space as constituted in Newtonian or Euclidean geometry. Central here is how resilience thinking draws upon the immanent interactive powers of life itself, as we've said, exemplified in these debates by island life as a self-regulating system. For us, this is the key reason why islands and islanders have emerged as the most high-profile bounded spaces for resilience thinking in debates about the Anthropocene more generally. But this also shows that resilience carries over some modern legacies, and that's what's at one end of our spectrum or continuum, with patchworks, as we'll see, being at the other. Resilience is seen as more replicable. It can unfold over space and time, most notably in the centering of islands and islanders in many debates as figures which the rest of the world can learn from. Thus, we do not think it's really useful to think of islands as blank spaces or laboratories or test beds for importing external reasoning. That's not what's really going on when we think about the island as the emblematic figure for thinking through resilience thinking in the Anthropocene. That would suggest that the geographical forms which Anthropocene thinking works with don't matter, that there really is a human nature divide, that everything's just in the minds of Anthropocene or resilience thinkers. To the contrary, it's with work with islands and indigenous islanders, in particular, as emblematic sites or spaces for working through the interactive adaptive power of life itself in resilience, that makes working with islands and islanders generative and productive, shaping the pathways and trajectories of resilience as a key analytic within wider Anthropocene thinking. What we are calling patchwork ontologies, which we see as a variation and development upon resilience along the continuum or sliding scale, are also increasingly prevalent in debates about the Anthropocene. So chapter 2 turns to explore in detail how patchwork ontologies characterise the works of many critical scholars, theorists, in particular experimental kind of approaches and artists, critical designers and activists today, engaged with debates about the Anthropocene. And as we'll explain, we don't think that really debate has got its head round just how many of these are explicitly choosing to work with islands and islanders as emblematic sites of relational entanglement in the Anthropocene. From Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World and her engagements with Japanese islander practices of matsutake mushroom cultivation, to Deborah Bird Rhodes' work with Aborigines in Australia and the concept of shimmer, to Phil Hayward's work with the archipelago in Haida and Scheller's work with local Caribbean island practices, as well as Robert Stevens' work on the archipelagic Americas, Tioea's work in Oceania, and the famous poet of the Anthropocene, Juliana Spar, her poetry is about the island of Hawaii, and Laura Watt's recently acclaimed work on energy islands and with Orkney Islanders. Compared to resilience, an important point about these kind of patchwork ontologies is that they much more obviously shift debate to how we are all already in the Anthropocene. Key is how patchwork approaches disrupt and develop the island ontology of resilience thinking, so that the modernist imaginary of islands existing in a flat one-dimensional space side by side, tracing continuities in relation over linear time, is replaced with a much more open island ontology of spatial and temporal becoming, working with the emergent disturbances and ongoing effects of the Anthropocene. Whilst this could be seen as an expansion of relational ontology, the key point about patchwork ontologies is that here working with islands is radicalised, destabilising the solutionalist or instrumentalising aspects of resilience, making patchwork approaches more open, less governmentalising and human-centred. If resilience approaches seeks to hold back or bounce back within transforming planetary change, then the work of what we call patchwork ontologists, such as those I just mentioned, and their engagement with islands, foregrounds how entanglements of relation are never fixed, and therefore disrupt modern and Euclidean notions of space-time in distinction to those of resilience. For patchwork ontologies, islands are not merely worlds that we are in. Rather, islands become aware of expressing our understanding our own process of world-making. Thinking with islands then importantly becomes a verb, as Tioea famously said, and a practice of opening ourselves to relational effects and knots of co-relational entanglements, rather than one of resilience which tends to rarefy the world and suborn us to it. Patchworks are fluid, momentary crossings, entanglements where there is no innate laws to be followed and nothing to be replicated. The emphasis is upon being open to possibilities, emergent tendencies, bringing the future into the present and so forth. In patchwork ontologies we discuss in the book, the focus is upon how we explore and journey, rather than merely reflect upon and become more aware of our relational interconnections, so as to become more resilient. So whilst we could obviously align patchwork approaches with developments in Western assemblage theory of Deleuze, or clearly Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, because it's all about emergent disturbances and effects, what we've identified for our reading over the last few years is that the geographical form and cultures which are doing some of the most important productive work are associated with islands. As Haraway herself says in Staying with the Trouble, the Anthropocene first came into the wider consciousness by observing the changing relational entanglements of islands and island cultures. And this is illustrated in a wide range of examples we examine in the chapter. But here we think that just as Darwin opened up the possibilities of resilience by working with islands, then we think Edward Glissant, can be seen as the early forerunner of the patchwork approach. As people will know, Glissant wasn't focused upon grasping relation in the sense of modern European thought, so he was writing about the islands of the Caribbean and creolization and the movements of creolization and the ongoing movements with disturbances and emergent effects. He was critiquing that kind of human nature binary of modern and colonial thought that fixed the islands in a fixed space of and time. He was focusing upon the ongoing movements and emergent disturbances, the oceanic currents, the colonial forces and so on, that move in relation. So our argument throughout is that it matters that Glissant wrote about islands. He was writing about the islands of the Caribbean, but his work famously is drawn upon to talk about how relations opened up globally. Our argument is that throughout, therefore, that it matters that these island writers were writing about islands, and that many contemporary authors who increasingly turn to older island scholars like Glissant are thinking with the relational entanglements of islands in order to generate patchwork approaches. Islands are not on the periphery in the generation of Anthropocene thinking. Again, they're not these blank spaces awaiting the insertion of some sort of new philosophical framework. Patchwork approaches think with islands and islanders to engender or inculcate other ways of becoming to modern frameworks of reasoning, as they recognise the Anthropocene as a condition in which we are all already in. After establishing that engaging islands and islanders in the Anthropocene are seen as highly productive for the generation of relational ontologies, thereby disrupting modernist frameworks of reasoning and a telos of linear progress, the second half of the book turns to how it is also productive of distinctive relational approaches to epistemology, those of onto-epistemology. In a relational ontology, questions of epistemology are not entirely separate from those of ontology, but are onto-epistemological, i.e., knowing is not a product of passive reflection, but of being itself. So in chapters 4 and 5, we seek to suggest that Anthropocene thinking with islands about epistemology can be approached via two lenses or tendencies, demarking two extremes of a sliding scale or imaginary, in which forms of relation become increasingly less modern, increasingly more focused on strange and weird or irreducible relations. So this moves us from correlation towards storiation. Just as island relational ontologies could be grasped on a disruptive continuum, captured at either pole through the lenses of resilience or patchworks, depending upon whether we are in modernity, understood as a grid of fixed space and time, the same is the case when it comes to how we think with these islands onto-epistemologically. Thus, Chapter 4 analyses how correlational approaches to onto-epistemology maintain a knowing human subject and a world of patterned regularity amenable to policy intervention. Here, islands are imagined as a correlational technology, the emblematic canary in the coal mine, where island changes are often seen as the first signs or indicators of the looming dangers of climate change. As Elizabeth de Leffroy says, the island is understood not just as the Earth, but as its anticipated future. Central for us, however, is not the fact that islands are just vulnerable or symbols of bigger forces at play or exposed, but rather the actual logic that's coming into play when we think with islands in order to develop correlational approaches. The idea that we can see and perceive something through changes in another entity, an epistemology of interrelation and correlation rather than one of linear cause and effect. So in these debates, climate change doesn't cause island changes, it manifests as, or in fact is, these changes. In onto-epistemological framings, we move from a temporal and spatial line of movement to one of synchronicity, which enables humans to better register, read and sense, transforming planetary conditions through their real-time effects. So in Chapter 4, we explain how drawing upon and working with islands and indigenous islanders in particular has become widely understood to be generative of correlation approaches. As we said, the famous trope of the canary in the coal mine, which dramatically shows one of the important ways in which the prevalence of this analytics of correlation is taking place. Islands and islanders as correlational machines, the turn to indigenous islanders' sensing abilities, the changing evolutionary pathways of island life itself as revealing the changing conditions of the Anthropocene, but also the massive development in sensing technologies and smart islands. These all converge around the logic of correlation. Whether it's looking at the sensing technologies of Singapore or the evolutionary pathways of a species on an island, they all adopt this logic of correlation. They all work with islands and as emblematic sites of relational entanglements and feedbacks for correlating and sensing the Anthropocene. By contrast, approaches of storiation, which we examine in Chapter 5, more forcefully focus and disrupt the modern binaries of subject, object, thought, being, and thus the focus on interrelations to a much greater extent than the logics of correlation. You can't kind of register and read and replicate the reading of relations in storiation in the same way as you can correlation. It's a less replicable or exportable model. So instead, storiation onto epistemologies engage islands and island cultures as emblematic holding sites for generating knowledge of the effects, traces and afterlives of modernity and colonialism by way of more speculative approaches and practices. So we've got the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, plastic washing up on island shores, the embodied movements of islanders existing within ongoing legacies of colonialism, islands as holding spaces for registering global warming, for registering nuclear testing and fallout and so on. Thus, storiation has this explicit concern for both the ongoing legacies and modernity of colonialism, which many of the other analytics do, but importantly, in storiation, there is also this concern for how these can't be effectively grasped or read by way of modern or correlational frameworks of reasoning. Instead, when it comes to storiation approaches in Anthropocene thinking more generally, we see the rise of the tropes of the weird, the ghostly, the haunting, embodied movements, and sometimes quantum ways of registering the Anthropocene on islands. Now, we obviously can't go into details in a short presentation, so here we just want to flag up again, perhaps this is something that people don't really know, that many of the most prominent Anthropocene scholarship is precisely developing this kind of approach of storiation through thinking with islands and island cultures. From Timothy Morton's work on hyperobjects, to Karen Barra's nuclear testing and fallout on the Marshall Islands, to Christina Sharp and Tiffany King's various examinations of black life living in the wake of the forces of colonialism. We explain in the book how they all converge around an analytics of storiation. In these debates, islands and island cultures in particular are readily employed to highlight how there is no away and no past in the Anthropocene, exemplified by how, when it comes to such vast multidimensional forces of global warming, there is no isolated or cut-off island existing just over there beyond the horizon. Some of the forces of global warming play out more immediately on the island, in the intensified hitting of hurricanes or cyclones around islands every year. Others stretch out for hundreds of thousands of years, in how long it takes the carbon to dissolve in the ocean surrounding the islands. Thus, in working with islands as emblematic sites of relational entanglements, we come to see a world which holds strange attractors and interconnections, rather than one of clear separations, linear causality, or hierarchy of branching trees, as in the case of a kind of a Darwinian linear understanding of life associated with resilience discourses. For authors like Timothy Morton, the effects of entangled relation mean that engaging islands in particular can provide valuable insights into the afterlives of objects and events in ways which transform modern understandings of them as isolated or contained. The future then acts back upon the past as the afterlife of relational effects associated with things like global warming or nuclear testing continue to reverberate across time and space in strange, weird, or as Karen Barra talks about on the Marshall Islands, quantum ways. Thus, in storiation approaches, the island increasingly figures as not only existing within complex relations of coloniality and global warming and transforming change, but as holding these forces and being held by them, disrupting modernist scales and distinctions. The rapid rise of what we call storiation in contemporary Anthropocene thinking draws upon and engages the geographical form of the island and island cultures to speculatively register these forces and intensities in ways which can profoundly disrupt modernist assumptions of time and space. The power of thinking with islands and island cultures in the development of contemporary storiation approaches has also involved a significant turn to older island writers. This would be inevitable as the island emerges as a key figure. And this has not really been recognised enough, we don't think. Indeed, we explain how the island scholar and poet Camus Brathwaite can be seen as opening up the line of thought of storiation, precisely because he understands the island dialectically as the embodied intra rather than inter relational movement associated with the ongoing legacies and effects of colonialism, which are held in and hold the present. So Brathwaite famously talks about the nana on the beach sweeping the stand, looking out onto the ocean, and dialectically colonialism comes into her body. It is her body. It is her embodied movements. So the nana on the beach is holding the forces of colonialism, registering them as her embodied movements. And Brathwaite is central to the work of many contemporary writers, quite explicitly. Big critical black studies thinkers who engage questions of the Anthropocene, like Christina Sharp's In the Wake and Tiffany King's Black Shoals, they basically foreground Brathwaite as a central figure for speculatively reading the ongoing legacies, effects and hauntings of colonialism, which problematise separations of the past from the present. So both correlation and storiation analytics are therefore situated, material and relational, and can be understood as a kind of post-human or more than human approaches to the generation of knowledge. But where they differ is that in correlation approaches is the patterned regularity of interrelational effects which is key, as adaptive interactive life correlates in ways which are amenable to facilitating human understanding and prediction, enabling us to read environmental change. the canary in the coal mine, the indigenous islander that enable us to correlate to changing forces. So in correlation, relational interaction thus takes place in a kind of universal or one world modernist conception of time and space. And correlational practices are seen as replicable models, which can be widely applied and exported elsewhere, so that the rest of the world can learn from island ecologies and life and islanders, much like resilience approaches are similarly exportable, because of how they adhere to these Newtonian linear conceptions of space and time. In the storiation approaches, however, relational interaction more explicitly problematises these modern notions of linear time and space. Thus, storiation approaches often speak of irreducible, embodied intra-relations, or of strange, unexpected forms associated with the afterlife legacies and ongoing effects of such forces of consumerism, waste production, colonialism, nuclear testing, and so on, of which islands and thinking with islands and islander life becomes exemplary. And as I say, this is just a start. Yeah, we don't claim that our four analytics are exhaustive. There are clearly many other ways in which we can think how the figure of the island and island cultures is being put to work in the generation of wider Anthropocene thinking. But what we want to do is open up an initial discussion about this. Too often, the island is we're locked in debates where the island is this figure of modern saving and reduced to a critique of modern imaginaries. When, whilst of course that's going on, what's going on to a massive extent is islands are major figures in the development of relational ontologies and epistemologies. The island is a generative force. It's not in the slipstream. So we want to start a conversation through breaking down the analytics of resilience, patchworks, correlation and storiation, these different relational ontologies and epistemologies that we feel are very prevalent in Anthropocene thinking. A discussion of why and how the island is taking place in the way it is in contemporary Anthropocene thinking. So in the conclusion to the book, we explore that and we start to map out what we think that could involve. But on a very practical level, perhaps this is a useful way to end the talk. We're going to be starting up a new reading group in 2021. Myself and Cassie and Micah are going to be leading that, where each month we're going to be discussing different texts, key texts, which work with islands to develop Anthropocene thinking. We have an ongoing, David and I have an ongoing section. It's now a permanent ongoing section of Island Studies journal called Anthropocene Islands, and we've had up to, I think, 60 people are interested in addressing those questions so far for that. The papers are starting to come in. An island philosophy email list, and of course we're going to be organising lots of sessions at conferences and standalone events. So I hope I've given you a taster of the book, and perhaps more importantly, a taster for what a critical agenda for island studies could look like if we start to break down analytically the ways in which work with islands and island cultures isn't just in the slipstream of Anthropocene thinking, but is actually productively and generatively driving it forward. And we think the reason for that is because the key problematic of Anthropocene thinking today is quite naturally that of relational entanglements. And it would inevitably be the case that those scholars interested in that question of relational entanglements would look for geographical forms and cultures that would enable that to be brought through and worked through. And that's why we think the island has become if not the emblematic figure for contemporary Anthropocene thinking. So thank you very much for your time, and we really look forward to questions.